Hey guys, Pallet Geek here, and today we're going to be doing some testing and modifications to the Engwe M20. My initial review was pretty positive, but now that I got the second battery pack on it, I'm going to see if I can modify the stock controller to squeeze just a little bit more power out of it. In addition to that, I've got a couple of other quality of life improvements, along with making this thing a little bit easier to pedal, at least for taller riders. Of course, the main upgrade here is the additional battery. The second battery installation was pretty straightforward. The mounting rail uses 3 M6 by 15mm screws, which oddly enough were not included, and I've heard the same from other M20 reviewers. It didn't bother me personally, as I keep so many screws on hand, but these really should be included in future kits for convenience and to prevent people from using the wrong size and buggering up the threads. The module includes tons of extra wire length, so I snipped this shorter to make for neater cables in the tiny underseat box. I also used this as an opportunity to clean up the wiring and replace the stock Dean's connectors with XT60, as well as to secure the electronics with some zip ties, as they were pretty much just rattling around in there unsecured from the factory. To tidy things up even more, I cleaned up some of the wiring on the rest of the bike by tucking it all into some plastic sleeving. The batteries are joined using a Yolin branded battery combiner. I had hoped that this would allow the batteries to work in parallel instead of alternating between the batteries, and using a watt meter, I confirmed that the combiner does indeed split the load equally between the batteries at the same time. Testing at the controller, the reading peaks at 1000 watts, while each battery individually reads a peak of around 500 watts. In my tests, neither the motor nor controller got the least bit warm, so I wanted to see if I could squeeze just a little bit more performance out of the stock controller. Unfortunately, increasing the current settings on the display does absolutely nothing according to the watt meter, so I took apart the controller to change it using a bit of trickery. The controller uses something called a shunt or current sense resistor to calculate how much power it's using. This measures the voltage drop across a known resistor value to determine how much power is being used. We can therefore trick the controller by adding another resistor in parallel, reducing the voltage drop and thus tricking the controller into providing more power. An additional 5 milliohm resistor in parallel with the other two will add 50% more power by my calculations. And in a complete and utter surprise to no one, this resulted in the expected 50% increase in wattage. The acceleration before was pretty mild, but pushing 1500 watts through this little motor definitely makes it feel a lot snappier when getting up to speed. Unfortunately, this doesn't change the top speed in the slightest, it just doesn't bog down and it climbs hills easier. Even though the bike tops out around 28 miles an hour, the wheel will spin freely up to 32 miles an hour. Because of this, I don't think there's an artificial speed limiter, just the electrical RPM limit of this particular motor with a 48-volt battery. So I know everyone always wonders about the maximum range on these e-bikes, and I was able to use my fancy new watt meter to get rough estimates of watt hours per mile. At pedal assist level 1, or around 15 miles an hour, I get an average of 12 watt hours used per mile, which on a 1250 watt hour dual battery bike, I could potentially go a little over 100 miles. At the other end of the spectrum, I went on the same 7-mile round trip and averaged a bit under 25 watt hours per mile, which should still get a very respectable 50 miles. I was convinced that Engwe's 47 miles per battery estimate was going to be an outrageous lie, but on flat ground with little wind, it seems entirely possible, even after my power mod. Satisfied with my minor performance boost, I moved on to some of the more quality of life improvements. As with many of my other bikes, a mirror is mandatory, so I used one of the same bar end style mirrors that I tack onto just about everything else I own. This one matches the look of the bike quite well and gives great visibility. I also wanted to replace the absolutely useless grommets that are on the headlights, so I 3D printed some more appropriate replacements which should actually work to keep dust and dirt out. Next was to increase the pedal gear ratio. The stock gear ratio really only allowed me to pedal up to about 20 miles an hour at a reasonable cadence, so I dug into my stash of bike parts and found a spare 58-tooth chainring, which is 10 teeth larger than stock. I used a handy-dandy crank puller to easily remove the stock cranks, so I can attach a new larger one. The offset of this chainring matches the stock, so the chain line was correct, but the chain itself was far too short. I had to order a longer chain and break it to the correct length, which happened to be the perfect tension at around 126 links. I was worried I wouldn't have enough torque to pedal at low speeds after this, but it felt quite okay without the motor assistance, and it was kind of like starting in third gear on the stock sprocket. Plus, with the added low-end motor power, you can just cheat anyways. My pedaling cadence now feels way better up to 25 miles an hour, meaning that pedal assist levels 1 through 4 are now really usable, with pedal assist 5 reserved as kind of my motorbike mode. Now mind you, I do bike kind of a lot, so my idea of a reasonable cadence is anything up to about 90 RPM, so your mileage may vary. One of the biggest problems with this bike is the fact that you can't adjust the seat. I've heard it fits riders under 5'9" pretty well, but not so much for my 6-foot tall self. Even on small bikes, you can usually at least adjust the seat height, and heck, if you don't like the seat, you can just swap it out for a whole new one. Not so much with this bike, however, as it has a seat that appears to only be compatible with this particular model of bike. The seat mounts using 4 studs through the frame, and to extend these, I tried using some coupling nuts and additional studs through the bottom to secure it to the frame. To prevent it from looking like I was riding on stilts, I whipped up a proper spacer in CAD and 3D printed it using almost a whole spool of TPU to provide some extra reinforcement. After a few revisions, I think I got it looking a lot more streamlined to match the bike, and it feels very solid. My ideal lowest seat height leaves my leg parallel with the ground at the highest point, and this riser just gets me to that point. Well, at this point, I'm actually very happy with the bike. I've seen other owners looking to upgrade the rear shock and the brakes, but they work well enough for me. Then again, most of my other bikes have suspension that looks like this, so I may be a bit biased. Likewise, many of my other bikes, including another one of my e-bikes, have rim brakes, so mechanical disc brakes don't really bother me either. Could some of these things be improved? Well, yeah, sure, but it's also a budget e-bike. But this brings up a very good point about what this bike is for, and who this bike is for. I think that this bike was not really meant to do any serious off-roading, but to be more of a cool-looking moped just for cruising around town. I know that's what I'll use it for, and I think it does a wonderful job at that, even completely stock. For those who want to customize, the low entry price and dual versus single battery option lets you save and spend money on the parts and upgrades that you want without breaking the bank. Not to mention that I've had very few problems with both of my ENGWE bikes, and the online community for upgrades, help, and support just keeps growing by the day. Well, as always, thanks for watching. Hopefully you got some good info about this bike from this video. And if not, hopefully you found my modification shenanigans at least entertaining.